So, Chris, you traveled here from Columbus, Ohio.
I did.
But you used to live here.
I did.
So when
Still have my phone number.
Do you still have your phone number? Yeah, what we want to talk about is geographic diversity as well. So you lived in Northern California. You worked for Sequoia, who I'm sure everybody in the audience knows. What made you decide to start a new venture and start it in Columbus, Ohio?
Sure. So, when I first joined Sequoia, this first partner meeting, that was one of those moments in time you just never forget. Number one, I felt like horribly outmatched for this group of individuals that were incredibly smart. And the other thing I remember was that there was a company on the docket that we were discussing investing in, and we passed on it for the one reason, because it was based in Petaluma. And it was too far from Silicon Valley. That was the mentality, right? And the reason that we had kind of gone to this conclusion was that if you look at the kinds of things we were investing in, really, it was real technology companies, like tech stuff. And it meant that you were investing in companies that were kind of at that bare metal layer. Well, fast forward a couple of years, the advent of cloud computing came about. And suddenly, this whole paradigm shifted where if you wanted to build even a consumer-facing website, you no longer needed to hire engineers that were writing code at that bare metal layer, right? You could rent that from Jeff Bezos or a whole host of other folks for as much or as little as you liked. And that meant that the paradigm had shifted, where the limiting factor to companies being successful was not how close were they to this engineering population. It was how close are they to their customers. And so Sequoia, we believed this very much, and that's what led us on a journey around the globe, opening up offices in India and China and Israel, all these great places. But then, out of just some sheer serendipity, there was a guy called John Kasich, who is now fairly well known as one of the former presidential candidates. He had been elected governor of Ohio. And in the course of that election, he had asked my partner, Mark Kwame, to come out to Ohio and open up a jobs development, economic development program. So Mark's out in Ohio, I'm doing my thing at Sequoia, and I'm out looking at a company in Ohio. And we were looking at the time at Sequoia Capital, Turkey. Like, should we go to Turkey? So I go to dinner with Mark, and Mark's like, what's going on at Sequoia? And I was like, oh, it's awesome. We're going to Turkey. It's amazing. And he was like, that's crazy. He's like, we used to pass on companies if they were in Petaluma. I was like, I know, but it's so fun. And he had this idea. He was like, well, what if instead of looking at Turkey, you looked at Ohio or you looked at the Midwest? And I was like, obviously, that's a silly idea. Come on. Rust Belt, nobody's doing anything innovative in the middle of the country. Everyone knows it's all Silicon Valley. I grew up in Ohio. Obviously, this is a bad idea. And he was like, well, just think about it. And he was like, so kind of, it was one of those ideas. It was so ridiculous. I had to prove to him that it was wrong. And so I went down this data gathering mission. And I was convinced I would find every piece of data I looked at would prove this was a terrible idea. And I was surprised when I found the opposite. It turns out every single piece of data that I found was convincing me that this was actually not a good idea. This was a great idea. This was the next frontier in investing. And here was California, the 8th largest economy in the world. Well, the Midwest would be the 5th. It's bigger than Brazil, it's bigger than Russia, it's bigger than India. It has the same time zones, a legal system, capital markets, and this went through a number of iterations where eventually, my fear was that one day I would walk into the office and somebody else would have started this idea and started this firm. And we set off a little bit because of fear motivation to start this in 2013. And we are now at what we believe is the forefront of investing in America.
When did you realize that you, a nice guy from Cincinnati, Ohio, had become a coastal elite and started talking about people in the middle of the country the way you just did?
Yeah, exactly. I think I was talking to a friend of mine who, so I lived here about 10 years, and I was talking to a friend of mine in Boston, and his response was, how's San Francisco? I said, that's amazing. We've got all these tech jobs. Everything's great. He's like, yeah. It sounds like it's the land of opportunity for the 1%. And I was like, whoa. That's a pretty derogatory way to describe it. I was like, why would you say that? He's like, don't you use like public bus lanes for private transportation? And don't you have the greatest disparity in wealth and all this kind of stuff? And I was like, well, nobody said it like that, but but yeah, and we have all these great things too. Doesn't every city want tech like San Francisco? And he was like, no, we don't. Like, We think there's a different way to do things than what may be evolving in San Francisco. And it's not to knock San Francisco. It's just that, don't come here and tell us how to, run our companies, how to run our economies when you guys might not have your house in order. It was a very jarring conversation that I'll never forget.
Mark, let's bring you into this conversation. Nexient is a domestic outsourcer. What does that mean?
That means that we put together a group of people in the Midwest who build software for other companies. So the idea was, we brought this together in 2010. The idea was that most of corporate IT was sending jobs to India, to Russia, to China, and that there was an opportunity to create a better service by taking advantage of what was happening in Silicon Valley and the resources in the Midwest. So we're headquartered in the Silicon Valley, and we try to take advantage of a lot of the product mindset that happens here and sort of the approaches that have been proven in building out a lot of the tech giants here. But we have most of our developers and testers are all in Michigan and Indiana. So we're 100% US. And the vast majority of our employees are in the Midwest.
How has the political climate affected Nexient?
It's interesting. We've been doing this long before the political climate got to where it is today. So it's probably helped us a little bit, but I think that people were already on the bandwagon for what we're doing. They were anyone who's worked with an offshore development project knows some of the pain points, right? The very first one is they're not awake when you are awake, right? And it's just, so somebody stays up late and somebody gets up early and it's just painful, right? So a lot of people were coming to us because they wanted to move faster, they wanted to be collaborative, and in order to do that, you needed people in the same time zone, you needed people that kind of got the cultural context, and so that was already happening. I think the political climate maybe added a little bit of fuel to the fire that was already happening, but and has brought us maybe more leads. But otherwise, it's been going well even before that.
Chris, what are you finding in the Midwest in Columbus, Ohio, that is helping drive your success that you might not have found out here?
A couple of things. Number one, I found out that all of our research was wrong. It actually, I think it dramatically understates the amount of activity that's going on in the Midwest. And that's because when I look in PitchBook, Crunchbase, all the typical data sources, it just misses all of the investments that are made in the Midwest. And I think what we found is that, as an example, that deal flow has been a massive surprise to us. So, Mark Andreessen was quoted as saying they see about 4,000 investment opportunities a year out here. So I was just curious, how much do we see? And it turns out we see 3,500 companies a year at Drive. And that's up from 1,800 the year before. This is on a growth trajectory that's there. So there's a tremendous amount of activity. I think the second thing that we're seeing, kind of tied to your point on the political climate, is that the conversations I'm having with people today are different than they used to be. In the beginning, people were like, "You're nuts. What are you thinking? You're leaving California for Ohio?" Even my movers, when they came to my house, the guy was literally like, "Whoa."
Can I say this? On your website, there's a picture of his daughter sitting on moving boxes crying.
Yeah. Well, that was another story. But yeah, that did happen. But even the movers were like, he was like, "Sorry, man." And I was like, "Well, we think it's an opportunity, but..." Today, when I meet with people, I think there have been enough pioneers in our portfolio, there are enough anecdotes that I can showcase for other people who are interested in having an impact in their career to come out and join companies in the Midwest. So, for example, we just recruited an amazing person out of Netflix, and I don't think he ever would have come back to Ohio 3 years ago, 5 years ago. But when he came back, what he was able to see is, look, I've got a choice. I can be this amazingly successful executive in this machine that is Silicon Valley at Netflix, and he was doing a great job. Or I can go to this company in Ohio where nobody else is bringing this kind of expertise, and the level of impact that I can have here is dramatic. And that ties into a political conversation where people out here particularly point out, Ohio voted for Trump and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, well, so what are you doing about it? You have a choice. Imagine that. Ohio was decided by 40,000 votes. That's one startup company. That's it. Just one successful company. So, why don't you come out and be a part of what can potentially be the tipping point of a solution. And that message now, without it sounding like what was remarkably crazy in the beginning, is now surprisingly mainstream, and we're repeating that again and again.
This question for both of you. Your organizations are in Ann Arbor and in Kokomo. Do you ever worry about bringing some of the bad stuff from Silicon Valley to these areas, and that you're going to change the ecosystem, and that's those very things that you went out there to capture?
Yeah, it's a great question. I honestly haven't worried too much about that. I think that there's a lot of the local culture that you get that kind of offsets that a little bit. So no, I haven't seen that yet. I don't know.
Housing prices?
Housing price. So far, no. You can live 5-10 minutes from our office for a couple $100,000. I had one person was telling me they had a $180,000 home that was a 15-minute drive. And he said, it's a little bit of a fixer-upper, but in the Silicon Valley, you're not going to hear that price.
What do you think about in terms of changing the culture?
We think about it a lot. We think about this as, look, imagine you were starting over with Silicon Valley. Like, how would you do it differently? And knowing where it is today, there's a lot of great things that are here that are amazing, that are special and unique. There's a lot of obviously terrible things, around diversity, inclusion, like a lot of the things you guys are talking about at this conference. I think that we look at this and say, this is our opportunity to, knowing what is going to happen 30, 40 years from now, how do we start with a different set of principles? How do we start with making diversity a priority? How do we make all of our companies report on this stuff? How do we increase the diversity in the leadership teams of our portfolio companies and help our portfolio companies understand things like innate bias that you might even realize that you've already selected into homogenous populations. So we spend a lot of time working on this stuff, and I think the reason that we're doing it is certainly because we feel like there is a moral obligation to do this, but that's the second order issue. The primary reason that we're doing this is we've just observed that these are more successful companies when you have a more diverse set of opinions around the table, and that can be geographic and racial and socioeconomic and a whole variety of things.
Let's get some microphones in the audience. I'm going to ask one more question, then we'll take a couple questions from the audience. I'm just curious, this is just one of those weird pieces of information I have in my head about Columbus, Ohio. Columbus is a huge test market for like fast food, and it's like where they go try all the new things because it's supposed to be this snapshot of America. Is that why you chose it? Has this played into your business plan at all?
So I didn't know that when we picked it, to be totally honest. We found when we were looking at this and saying, where should we put Drive Capital? We were like, well, if it's Midwest, we got to go to Chicago. But then we started looking at this and saying, the really important thing for us to do is be in close proximity to the largest quantity of entrepreneurs. And the entrepreneurs are in the urban centers. And so we got out a map, and we just literally drew on Google Maps. You can draw a radius of 200 miles around every city in the Midwest, and we picked Columbus just because of that. Because within a 200-mile radius, I get to Cincinnati, I get to Indianapolis, Dayton, Detroit, Ann Arbor, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and I've got Columbus. So I've got the highest volume of these cities. And it takes a venture capitalist, a map and all this stuff to figure it out. It's like everyone else is like, well, that's why it's a logistics hub for the East Coast. And I was like, well, I didn't know that.
All right, we're going to go to the audience for a couple of questions. I do want to point out something. You are two only straight white guys for the day. Just letting you know. Trusting you all to behave. Because we're talking about geographic diversity. Okay. Who's got the mic?
Okay, so I'll start, white lady over here. Monica Miller, Barebones PR. I wanted to say to you, Chris, and maybe Stewart, maybe you heard him say this, but you just a few moments ago, probably unwittingly, subconsciously, unconsciously said, diversity and inclusion, things that you guys are talking about at this conference. And I wanted to just let you recognize that you are the one talking about it, and that's really important for you to own, to make sure that you see yourself as part of the conversation, because we've all been talking about how important it is that white men are participating and not just leading, but participating in it. So there you go. There you go.
Thank you. See, they're behaving. That's very nice.
Exactly.
I'm going to ask a question.
Okay, over here.
Hi. So I went to the University of Notre Dame, and I'm still very involved in what we're doing out there. A lot of it is around innovation and tech and entrepreneurship. And I'm just wondering what role educational institutions, who I think do much better when it comes to diversity and inclusion than corporations, Like, do you guys work with them, or what role can higher educational institutions have in spreading tech and making sure that it stays diverse?
You're in Ann Arbor, University of Michigan.
Yeah, so we what's that? I didn't hear what you said.
Go blue.
Oh, go blue. All right. Yeah. So we work with about 25 universities within about 150 miles of Ann Arbor. So we go out and work with the computer science departments and other engineering departments to influence the curriculum. We spend a lot of time getting to know the students, and we bring them in to build the workforce that we have. So we love the universities in the Midwest. There's some fantastic universities, Michigan as well as these other 25 that we're working with. So we're big fans, and that absolutely helps us. So the more diverse the population coming out of there, the easier it is for us to be inclusive at Nexient, and we'd love to be able to do that even more than we are today.
And are you working with community colleges as well?
Yeah, we work with Washtenaw Community College, and we've actually spent time with them helping develop curriculum around automated testing. So getting people actually into a set of courses around how to do automated testing with software, and then it gives us a great set of a pipeline of people coming in that we can hire.
Can I jump in on this one?
Sure, of course.
So I actually take the other side of the argument. I don't think universities are doing enough. And I'll tell you why. Because if you look at the national, look at what people are investing in. Like, I think it's pretty clear in general that the venture community at large is investing in technology. And the folks who are going to start technology companies have an advantage if they're coming from electrical engineering and computer science. And if you look at those graduation rates across the country from an inclusion standpoint, they're terrible. They're 80% male, 20% female. Like, this has got to change. And to me, there are some examples of schools that are doing a great job of this. Look at Harvey Mudd. So Harvey Mudd, Maria's gotten the school up to 50-50 in computer science. And now that they've done that, that's being replicated at places like Carnegie Mellon. And now Carnegie Mellon's up to 40% of their computer science graduates are women. But these are like these are two schools that I can give you the examples of. Like, this is where, if we really want to change this, I think talking about it is great, and we've got to keep doing this stuff. But what we really got to do is, the same way that people were like, what's going on in the Midwest is interesting, it's great, I want to talk about it. Well, I moved there, okay? Like, I moved my whole life, my whole family, I'm betting my whole career on this being successful. I think universities need to do the same thing as it relates to diversity. And we need to make sure that these inclusion rates are increasing to levels, especially in these fields where they are the pipeline of activity. So, we believe strongly in this. We're working to found a nonprofit right now that goes into the K through 12 education to try and increase the number of women and girls who graduate to go into these STEM careers, because that pipeline is a relatively small timeline away from what we're investing in. That's, to us, that's like 2 years away from where we'd be able to back more entrepreneurs who've gotten those advantages.
Let's thank our panel, Chris and Mark.